Now we will go to 2713 and continue testimony, but first I'd like to hear from the sponsor. The sponsor, please, of 2713, which is Senator Mendes. And let me just bring it up on here, 1 second. It's an act relating to criminal offenses, commercial sexual activities. Senator Mendes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairwoman and members of the committee. I will try not to be redundant, as I know that you've heard some compelling testimony today. I want to break down my presentation of this bill into several categories. I want to talk about terminology, history, legality, and then also a moral conversation, and just kind of my own personal perspective. I'll try to keep it brief, though. So terminology, I want to note some important terminology as we discuss this legislation. I will try to use the term sex work because it is more accurate and rooted in basic dignity and the intent of the legislation, and an accepted term by folks who choose to be in the industry. However, the general law that we are seeking to address comes with antiquated language and never sought the approval of impacted peoples and uses such language as prostitution. And I am highlighting this because I will use that term because of the current language and the law requires me to, and not because I necessarily believe it's appropriate. On terminology, I will often refer to women when referring to people who are disproportionately impacted by policing and criminalization of sex work. However, I acknowledge that this work and the impact on its over-criminalization is not assigned to any gender or people. However, historically, sex work prohibition has been heavy-handedly an oppressive tool designed to subjugate and disempower women. So, get myself together here. A little bit of the history, and you actually heard a piece of this, so I'll try to be really brief, from Hannah from the ACLU. The criminalization laws have been traditionally, a discrimination against women. We've seen that in Rhode Island. And the persistent and inevitable selection of enforcement has disproportionately criminalized female sex workers. Second, the prostitution laws to be invasive are designed to be invasive of personal privacy, whether the person chooses to engage in the private, consensual sexual activity for recreation or in the exchange of some sort of value. And the three, because the crime involves consensual parties, the police are left, as you heard, to use entrapment techniques. And I think this was very important and compelling for me when looking at this legislation. I want to just give some bullet points of what this legislation does do and then what it doesn't do. This legislation does decriminalize sex work. This legislation, I'm very, very excited about this piece of legislation. 11-34.1-5 has an expungement provision. This expands eligibility for expungement of criminal records for past convictions related to sex work and removes the classist economic barriers currently in place for expungement, allowing folks to expunge their records at no cost upon petition of the person 1 year after completion of their sentence. What this bill does not do. Respectfully ask the committee to watch for baseless stigmatizing language or baseless fear-mongering language. This bill does not impact any sex trafficking crimes, especially against minors. This is still an offense under federal law, Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1591. Sex trafficking of children, or by force, or fraud, or coercion of any kind, in reference to this piece of legislation, undoing any protections, it does not do any protections of our minors, and the insinuation or assumption that this undoes any protection for trafficking or minors is erroneous and fear-mongering tool. Since the inception of the federal trafficking law in 2000, 13 cases with 20 defendants have been charged in Rhode Island. Because of said federal sex trafficking law defines sex trafficking as the use of force, fraud, coercion, or of minors into the sex industry. Federal cases can help us understand what abuse within sex industry looks like and when it happens. The majority of cases that were charged, and I'll skip the history because there's like a whole bunch of years here, there was an additional one case in 2013. During this time, Rhode Island had a sex trafficking task force with federal money allocated to sex trafficking investigation. How did the police find these victims? Of 17 cases, none were discovered through prostitution stings or prostitution investigation. This law will not prohibit or prevent the prosecution or even the discovery of sex traffickers. I'm going to skip a couple of things because you did hear it, and I'm going to try to wrap this up. And you heard this from, yeah, you're welcome. This bill, what it does not do, it does not incentivize sex trafficking. It actually empowers and gives autonomy to those who choose it. There's an argument that it would increase sex buyers on the street. Again, this law does not change what can be done in public. This idea that all of a sudden the streets would be filled with solicitation, this decriminalizing a private act between two consenting adults. I'm asking to resist the images of cluttered streets and solicitation. It is not rooted in reality. I will save you a lot of the other kind of data. I'm sure you received a packet from Coyote, ACLU, Renew Weber, filled with data. But there was a couple of times in testimony where we asked what was the intent of this legislation. And I'd like for a moment to explain that because I think it's really important, especially in the face of such horrific stories and experiences. What would be the intent of this? And I think I want to share something very personal. So my dad had given up law school to be an inner city minister and a prison chaplain. I grew up in the inner city. I grew up where my home and my doors in my family's home and my mother and my father's doors were always open to former sex workers, current sex workers, formerly incarcerated folks, foster youth, runaways. We used to joke around because my dad would drive down the street and say, hey to this person, hey to that person, how do you know this person? Jail, how do you know this person? Prison. I was like, my brother said to my dad one time, he was 6, he's like, all your friends are in jail. But that's because that's the house I grew up in. And I am not speaking as someone who is an impacted person. And I want to be clear about that because I do not always appreciate when people speak on my behalf when I'm an impacted person, so I want to explain kind of my positioning. But I grew up at a very young age understanding there was a system that hurt people. I remember women coming to my mother pregnant because they left prison and because they were a sex worker, the security guards thought they could rape her and get away with it. I remember young women coming to my parents' door and being afraid of exploitation. And I want to be really clear that this legislation in no way is intended or can continue exploitation. I also came from that background as growing up being exposed to a lot of faith-based organizations, which had a rescue mindset of trying to rescue people from exploitation. This piece of legislation is rooted in rights. What is a person's right? If they choose to use their body in a consenting environment, they have the right to do that. And no one has, and it is within their choice to do that. And so I am coming from a system, and particularly an organized religion, where there's a lot of taboo around sex. There's a lot of patriarchal and white supremacy kind of ideas, and that comes with the white savior syndrome, which means that we're going to go and save people. This is what are people's rights, and their rights to either choose an industry and participate in it, be able to negotiate their wages, to be able to hire safety, to be able to seek medical care without being criminalized. Right now, we're seeing an increase of labor unions across the country, and we could, through decriminalization, see those who choose to enter this field in this industry unionize, bargain for collecting bargaining rights and the protections. And I think that a lot of the exploitation and the trauma that we heard happened under the current legislation that we see. And it is because it is in the shadows, it is over-criminalized, and it is shrouded in shame. And my intent, and my deep, deep intent in this legislation is to only be a vessel for those who choose this industry and choose to have the right to participate in this industry without criminalization. That is my intent, my heart's work, and my place in this.
Thank you. Senator Archambault?
Yeah, thank you. Senator, I think the clause you have on the expungement portion of the bill is very sound. And I think that the more expungement laws we have that can help people to get back their lives back together and get on their feet, the better. I even have one I'm putting in, the lower felonies, nonviolent, to 5 years, which would help people that couldn't get things off their record. So I think that's very sound. And I do appreciate you saying, in light of the compelling testimony we had earlier, that you're not an impacted person. That goes a long way. I think that'll draw some heartfelt empathy. My issue generally with, I talked earlier about Mills-Hahn principle. What I was really getting at was it's a concept that utilitarianism, which is where a libertarian philosophy comes from. Now, I think that everyone should have a libertarian streak. Our founding fathers, you got to be ready to fight. This is the kind of country where we stand up for our rights, and if you don't respect them, we're going to fight. But I don't see, based on all the testimony that we've heard here, and 56 years of being on this planet, I just don't see, and a lot of years prosecuting stuff, I just don't see this as a victimless crime. I don't see it as well, let's take the crime aside for a second. I just don't see it as a victimless act. I think there may be instances where that's the case, but we've just heard compelling testimony that that convinces me, and even before the testimony, that you can't divorce trafficking from the conversation, and I think that's the challenge here. Rather than just redacting and removing the whole thing, there's a voice that's speaking loudly. That's people coming from around the country to address issues that may be sounder dealt with in a global conversation than just divorced from it. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and if I can just reply, and I know we've got time to hear from other testimonies. It makes sense to me, but I want to really be clear that blurry line, that conflation, that kind of just jumbledness is because it is under the umbrella, in my opinion, the intent of this is because it is under the shroud of shame. They are lumped together because they are criminalized. And when you give the people that choose to participate in the industry the right to do so, it is very clear who doesn't want to be there, and they have the right to extract themselves from that situation. But the ones that do have the right to participate in that situation, and it will be under criminalization, they're all lumped together, which can be very, very dangerous. But I believe that the people that choose a consensual situation should have the right to do so, and we will be very, very clear about the ones who do not and help protect them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Quesada. Senator Quesada.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just sitting here and listening to all the testimony we've been here tonight. Remember me when I was younger at the Dominican Republic to hear so many cases of young women who were sell them by the parents sometime. And I don't think they choose. That's the problem. They didn't choose. They made them. And that's what we hear today. To hear so many testimonies saying how maybe by love, by somebody who tell them sold all this thing, or so many testimony we hear people who go to poor country and invite these women to go to Spain to work, supposedly to work. And when they get there, they get the passport away and they don't allow them to go back to their country. Then I don't think a lot of people choose to be in that life. I think a lot of time they make them. And that's the big difference between somebody who want to be and somebody who are there because they made them to be there, and they're scared and they're afraid and they don't have no other way to be out of that life.
I agree, and I'm thankful for the federal legislation that is in place to protect those women that are in situations they do not choose. And we heard a lot of stories from women that did not choose this, but there are rights to those who do choose, and there's a delineation there, and there's laws. There should be laws for both. Right now, there isn't. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Senator De La Cruz.
Thank you, Chairwoman. When it comes to decriminalization, I think of other drug decriminalization in Portugal, and how the individuals engaged in drug use aren't incarcerated, right? So I agree with Senator Archambault in that we don't want to punish women who are in this situation. So I fully agree with you there. But when I look at the people who testified and sitting behind you, shaking their head in strong disapproval, that this is not something that women choose. For the vast majority of them, they are put into a position like this against their will. And I, just can't support the legislation. But thank you. I appreciate you coming to testify. I see the passion. I really know that you believe it because I hear it, I see it. So, and I know when I put in a piece of legislation, I'm invested in it as well. And I see that in you, but just the overwhelming testimony. And I see the pain, I hear the pain.
Feel it.
And yeah.
I feel it as well, and I wish we had better protections for folks that did not choose. But yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions by committee members?